Operation Barbarossa began before dawn on 22 June 1941. To many Germans in command, it was supposed to be the decisive campaign of the war. One vast strike that would destroy Soviet military power in a single season, secure resources for the Reich, and end the strategic danger in the East before Britain and the United States could fully shape the conflict. In planning papers, staff maps, and command conferences, the campaign was presented as a historical necessity and an operational opportunity. Through German eyes, it looked like a bold but manageable gamble. What happened instead was a campaign that exposed the gap between operational brilliance and strategic illusion. The opening weeks brought dramatic victories, huge encirclements, and scenes that seemed to confirm every German assumption. But by winter, the Wehrmacht was exhausted in front of Moscow. The Soviet Union was still fighting, and Germany had entered a war of attrition it was not built to win. To understand Barbarossa through German eyes, we have to separate what they believed from what they faced. Planning was not irrational in every detail. German commanders had real strengths, experienced staff systems, flexible mission command, mobile operational doctrine, and a military culture shaped by rapid campaigns in Poland and France. Many officers expected resistance, but they expected a Soviet collapse under pressure. Their error was not one wrong move. It was a chain of assumptions that turned early success into strategic failure. In the winter of 1940-41, Hitler's political view hardened into military direction. The Soviet Union was to be defeated quickly. In one campaign, by destroying its field armies west of the Dvina and Dnieper rivers, then advancing toward key political and economic centers. The broader ideological vision was explicit. The East would provide land, grain, oil, and strategic depth. In this framework, military planning and political objectives fused from the start. At the operational level, the German plan divided the invasion into 3 army groups. Army Group North would strike toward Leningrad. Army Group Center, the strongest formation, would drive through Minsk and Smolensk toward Moscow. Army Group South would move into Ukraine, where agricultural and industrial targets mattered deeply to Berlin. This structure looked comprehensive: multiple strategic axes, coordinated offensives, and room for exploitation. Yet even before the first shot, contradictions were visible. The campaign aimed at destroying Soviet armies, seizing huge territories, and capturing political capitals. Simultaneously, these goals competed for time, fuel, rail capacity, and command attention. In a short campaign, such tension might be survivable. In a long campaign, it becomes fatal. German intelligence assessments reinforced confidence. Soviet forces were large but judged brittle. Purges, poor leadership quality, weak communications, and supposed inferiority in doctrine were expected to produce rapid disintegration once major border battles were lost. Some reports warned that Soviet reserves were deeper than assumed, but these warnings never fully overruled the dominant belief that the Red Army would collapse after initial encirclements. Logistics, the least glamorous part of war planning, was treated as manageable rather than decisive. German planners knew distances were enormous, roads often poor, and rail gauges incompatible. They assumed that swift advances and captured stockpiles would compensate. They also expected that victory would come before structural shortages became campaign-ending problems. This assumption looked reasonable only if the enemy dissolved quickly. If the enemy kept fighting, supply mathematics would take command away from operational ambition. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts, truck wear, horse losses, and rail conversion delays would dictate what offensives were possible. On 22 June, the invasion opened with immense force. Luftwaffe strikes targeted Soviet airfields and command nodes. Panzer groups pierced forward. Infantry armies widened breaches, and headquarters pushed for rapid exploitation before Soviet lines stabilized. In the first days, German commanders saw what they had hoped to see: confusion, fragmented resistance, and opportunities for deep encirclement. The Białystok-Minsk battle produced one of the largest early pockets. Soviet losses were severe, and thousands of prisoners moved westward under German guard. To officers reading daily reports, this looked like proof that the campaign model worked. By July, Smolensk also became a major operational success, again with high Soviet losses. The narrative of imminent Soviet collapse remained intact. But beneath victory reports, warning signs multiplied. Soviet formations reappeared faster than expected. Units thought destroyed returned in new configurations. Counterattacks were often costly and poorly coordinated, yet they forced the Germans to spend time and fuel. Operational tempo remained high, but not as effortless as post-war myth later suggested. German armored spearheads outrun support elements repeatedly. Trucks failed at increasing rates. Recovery services could not keep pace with mechanical losses. Horses, still essential for much of the army's transport, suffered under distance and supply stress. Rail conversion from broad Soviet gauge to European gauge moved slower than operational demand required. Every kilometer gained widened the logistical gap. This is where planning met reality in hard numbers. A panzer division could win battles brilliantly, but if fuel arrived late, it became a static formation with guns. Infantry could hold pockets and secure flanks, but if transport lagged, artillery shells and food became uncertain. Success at the front generated greater strain behind the front. By August, command debates intensified around the campaign's main objective. Many German professionals favored a direct and sustained drive on Moscow from Army Group Center. They argued that Moscow was the Soviet command hub, rail nexus, and symbolic center whose fall might trigger strategic collapse. Hitler increasingly prioritized the flanks, Leningrad in the north and Ukraine in the south. From Berlin's perspective, this was not irrational. Ukraine promised grain and industry. The Donbas and later Caucasus oil were vital in strategic thinking. Destroying Soviet forces in the south also seemed necessary before a final central push. Yet each redirection consumed time in the one resource Barbarossa could not replace. Weather window. The Kyiv encirclement in September was a massive German victory. Through German eyes, it seemed to validate Hitler's flank-first decision. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet prisoners were claimed, and Army Group South achieved a dramatic operational result. But victory had a strategic price. The central advance toward Moscow resumed later, after critical weeks had passed. When Operation Typhoon, the offensive toward Moscow, began in October, German forces still delivered powerful encirclements at Vyazma and Bryansk. Again, Soviet losses were severe. Again, reports suggested that one final effort could end the campaign. Yet, by then, autumn mud, the Rasputitsa, began to paralyze movement. Roads dissolved into deep sludge. Wheeled transport slowed to a crawl. Recovery, maintenance, and resupply became battles of their own. The Wehrmacht had not been equipped for prolonged operations under these conditions at such distance. Winter clothing was insufficient, because a long winter campaign was never supposed to happen. Lubricants failed in freezing temperatures. Weapons maintenance grew harder. Troops, already worn from months of operations, faced climatic stress on top of combat fatigue. Meanwhile, the Soviet state did not collapse. It relocated industrial capacity eastward, mobilized new formations, tightened command structures, and absorbed extraordinary losses while preserving strategic continuity. Through German eyes, this resilience was repeatedly underestimated. Intelligence and planning frameworks could not fully process an opponent that kept regenerating under catastrophic pressure. Moscow itself became the psychological focal point. German units reached suburbs and key approaches, and some reconnaissance elements observed distant city landmarks. To men in forward units, the objective seemed close enough to touch. But closeness on a map did not equal capability on the ground. Supply weather, exhausted manpower, and defensive depth turned proximity into stalemate. In December 1941, Soviet counteroffensives struck along broad sectors in front of Moscow. German formations, overextended and underprepared for deep winter defense, were forced back from advanced positions. The myth of uninterrupted German initiative in Barbarossa ended there. The campaign had failed in its core objective. The Soviet Union remained in the war, with growing capacity to continue it. From a German operational perspective, this was the turning point where planning assumptions collapsed together. The Red Army had not disintegrated. Logistics had not been solved by speed. Strategic priorities had not been reconciled by command improvisation. Climate and distance had not been secondary factors. They were decisive. It is tempting to reduce Barbarossa to one decision: Kiev versus Moscow, or Hitler versus the General Staff. Reality is harsher. Even a cleaner decision sequence might not have delivered strategic success because the foundational premise was flawed. Germany tried to win a short war against a continental power with deep manpower reserves, industrial relocation potential, and political willingness to absorb losses at unimaginable scale. German command culture itself was both strength and vulnerability. Mission command encouraged initiative and local flexibility, often producing tactical brilliance. But this same system depended on coherent strategic intent and sustainable logistics. When strategic aims multiplied and supply collapsed, initiative at lower levels could not reverse the larger trend. Air power followed a similar pattern. The Luftwaffe achieved major early effects, especially against forward Soviet aviation and communications. But as front depth expanded, support demands widened. Aircraft availability, maintenance strain, and airfield distance reduced the capacity to shape events uniformly across the theater. What looked overwhelming in June became increasingly stretched by October. Another planning weakness was economic underestimation. German war planning expected access to Soviet resources to improve sustainability. But resources in hostile territory are not automatically usable. Infrastructure damage, partisan activity, transport constraints, and administrative limits slowed extraction. The campaign consumed more than it captured, especially in the short term. Partisan warfare, initially secondary in many German assessments, grew in significance as occupation deepened. Rail disruption, local attacks, and security commitments diverted troops from frontline functions. Occupation policies, often brutal and self-defeating, intensified resistance rather than stabilizing the rear. Through German eyes at the planning stage, rear area security was a supporting function. In reality, it became a major drain. The human dimension mattered too. German troops entered the campaign after successive victories, confident in doctrine and leadership. Morale remained high through many early operations, but confidence is not a substitute for winter gear, fuel, medical resilience, or replacement cycles. By late 1941, combat effectiveness varied sharply across units. Some formations remained dangerous, others were hollowed by attrition and exposure. In retrospective German military writing, a common argument emerged. Political interference ruined an otherwise winnable campaign. There is truth in parts of this. Strategic indecision and ideological directives harmed coherence. But this explanation can also function as self-protection. Even a more professionalized command line still faced the same continental distances, logistical limits, and enemy regeneration. Barbarossa's planning model assumed that battlefield destruction of Soviet border armies would produce systemic collapse. Instead, it produced systemic adaptation. Soviet command learned while fighting. Industrial systems moved and resumed output. Reserve mobilization deepened. Command and control improved unevenly but significantly. German planning had prepared to defeat the Soviet Army of June. By winter, it faced a transformed Soviet war system. The campaign also illustrates the danger of confirmation bias in wartime assessment. Early encirclements reinforced prior assumptions, so contradictory evidence was discounted. Every major pocket looked like the beginning of the end, even as the enemy continued to form new armies. Operational success became a lens that obscured strategic deterioration. Timing against global context made the failure more severe. Germany sought to end the Eastern War quickly, before other powers could fully mobilize. Instead, Barbarossa extended the war and locked Germany into a two-front struggle under worsening economic and military ratios. After December 1941, with the United States in the war and the Soviet Union unbroken, Germany's strategic position became fundamentally weaker. Through German eyes at planning stage, Barbarossa was the campaign that would solve strategic pressure. Through German eyes by winter, it had multiplied pressure. The front was longer, losses were heavy, and the war had become exactly what many planners hoped to avoid: a prolonged industrial attrition conflict. Could Barbarossa have succeeded under different execution? Historians continue to debate variants. Earlier start, tighter objective selection, direct Moscow focus, stronger logistical preparation. These counterfactuals can illuminate decisions, but they cannot erase structural constraints. Germany lacked the margin required for prolonged uncertainty against that scale of opponent. A key lesson is that operational art cannot compensate indefinitely for strategic overreach. German command in 1941 produced remarkable operational episodes, but episodes do not equal outcomes. While a continental scale punishes mismatches between ambition, means, and time. Another lesson is that intelligence must be treated as a dynamic process, not a one-time estimate. German assessments captured some Soviet weaknesses correctly, but they underestimated capacity for adaptation. In modern terms, they assessed initial state more accurately than system resilience. That error shaped every subsequent decision. The campaign also reminds us that logistics is not rear area bureaucracy. It is combat power in motion. Fuel tonnage, rail conversion rates, maintenance cycles, and weatherized equipment were not secondary details. They were strategic determinants. Barbarossa demonstrates that an army can win many battles and still fail the war objective if sustainment collapses. In documentary memory, Barbarossa is often split between two myths: either unstoppable German blitzkrieg betrayed only by winter, or inevitable German failure from day one. Reality is harsher and more useful. Germany created genuine military success in the opening phase. But success was built on assumptions that could not survive prolonged resistance. Winter was not the cause. It was the condition that exposed accumulated planning error. By the end of 1941, the campaign's verdict was clear. Germany had not achieved decisive victory. The Soviet Union had survived, adapted, and counterattacked. The war in the East was no longer a short campaign but a long struggle Germany was structurally ill-prepared to sustain. Operation Barbarossa through German eyes is therefore a story of confidence. Speed and real battlefield skill colliding with strategic reality. Planning expected collapse. Reality delivered endurance. Planning sought decisive closure. Reality opened a deeper war. That gap between what command believed and what the battlefield system produced is the central truth of Barbarossa. In the opening months, German officers saw confirmation everywhere: encirclements, prisoners, retreating fronts, broken command networks. By winter, they saw something else: an enemy still fighting, their own system overextended, and a strategic horizon suddenly longer than anything they had prepared for. Barbarossa did not fail because Germany could not fight. It failed because Germany fought the wrong war plan against the wrong assumptions, on the wrong scale of time. And once that mismatch became visible, no tactical brilliance could hide it. To see this more clearly, It helps to step inside a hypothetical German operations room in late July 1941. The wall maps are updated daily with fast-moving arrows. Unit symbols for panzer groups still point eastward. Reports arrive in cycles. Claims of destroyed Soviet formations. Estimates of captured equipment. Weather summaries, rail conversion progress, and requests for fuel priority. The mood is still confident but not calm. Every success report is followed by a demand for one more push, one more encirclement, one more week of favorable conditions. Command language remains aggressive, yet increasingly anxious. That contrast tells us a lot. Planning assumptions are still alive, but reality is beginning to erode them. From the German perspective, there was also a cultural habit formed by previous campaigns. In Poland and France, operational shock produced strategic collapse quickly. Once command systems broke, governments lost control, and military defeat turned rapidly into political decision. In the Soviet campaign, German commanders looked for the same pattern. They expected a tipping point. They believed every major encirclement might trigger it. But the Soviet state did not behave like previous opponents. It absorbed military disaster without immediate political collapse. Through German eyes, this looked irrational at first. In strategic terms, it was resilience. Terrain compounded the problem in ways German planning papers acknowledged but never fully internalized. Distances in the Soviet theater were not just larger, they were campaign-defining. A drive that looked straightforward at map scale became a chain of physical constraints at road scale. Dust in summer damaged engines and air filters. Autumn mud turned movement schedules into guesswork. Rivers demanded bridging and engineering support under pressure. Urban nodes were fewer and farther apart than Western European operational habits expected. Every delay forced commanders to make choices between speed, flank security, and sustainment. Even when the Wehrmacht won tactical victory often consumed irreplaceable assets. A successful encirclement required fuel-heavy maneuver, prolonged artillery support, and infantry effort to compress and clear pockets. Clearing operations were expensive in time and ammunition. By the time one pocket was reduced, another operational objective demanded immediate movement. This created a pattern of cumulative fatigue. Units did not reset between major actions. They stacked major actions continuously. German replacement systems could not keep quality at the opening level. Experienced junior leaders were especially hard to replace. Mechanized warfare depended heavily on competent company and battalion leadership for tempo, improvisation, and coordination. As attrition removed these leaders, unit effectiveness degraded unevenly but steadily. Reports might still show divisions available, yet their internal quality profile changed month by month. The same was true of machinery. A tank listed on strength was not always operational. A truck assigned to a division did not guarantee delivery capacity of spare parts. Tires, mechanics, and road conditions were all under stress. German planning often counted formations by nominal order of battle. Reality counted them by what could move and fight today. Another crucial gap between planning and reality was the political military burden of occupation policy. German strategy required stable rear areas for transport and exploitation. But occupation practices generated hostility, fear, and resistance at scale. This was not only a moral catastrophe, it was a strategic one. Brutality consumed security forces, disrupted rail lines, and undermined local cooperation that logistics needed. Through German eyes focused on front-line objectives, rear area instability was often treated as secondary. In fact, it directly weakened operational endurance. By autumn, weather became the visible symbol of deeper structural stress. It is common to say, General Winter defeated Germany, but winter did not appear unexpectedly in Russia. What winter did was expose planning that had no robust margin for seasonal disruption. Clothing shortfalls, lubricant failures, medical strain, and transport paralysis were symptoms of a campaign design that assumed conclusion before severe winter operations would be required. German command responses in late 1941 reveal this exposure. Emergency redistribution of winter gear, ad hoc defensive orders, and debates over hold versus withdraw were signs of a system no longer controlling initiative. Front commanders increasingly requested permission to shorten lines for survivability. Hitler increasingly demanded holding forward positions for political and morale reasons. This tension reflected a deeper truth. Strategic flexibility was shrinking. At the intelligence level, one of the most damaging German errors was serial underestimation of Soviet force generation. In multiple operational phases, German estimates of remaining Soviet strength proved too low. New Soviet armies appeared where planners expected only fragments. Even when Soviet units lacked quality at first, quantity plus persistence changed the operational equation. Germany could destroy formations repeatedly, but destruction no longer produced strategic closure. In this sense, Barbarossa became a paradox. The Wehrmacht was doing many of the things it had been trained to do: deep maneuver, encirclement, command initiative, and still moving toward strategic failure. That paradox only makes sense if we distinguish operational success from strategic sufficiency. Germany had the first, and lacked the second. The campaign also altered German strategic options for 1942 and beyond. Because Barbarossa failed to conclude decisively, Germany had to choose among bad alternatives: renew offensive action with depleted strength, shift priorities south for resources, or transition to strategic defense earlier than political leadership would accept. The 1942 Southern Campaign was shaped directly by this unresolved outcome. What looked like a new opportunity was, in large part, an attempt to repair the consequences of 1941. Through German eyes, in retrospective military memoirs, blame often moved upward or outward. Hitler's interference, weather, road quality, Soviet numbers, intelligence gaps, all those factors mattered. But the deeper issue was design. Barbarossa combined maximal political aims with minimal temporal margin. It required too much to go right, for too long, against an opponent that could still regenerate after catastrophe. This is why the campaign remains so important for modern military analysis. It demonstrates how highly competent armed forces can fail when strategic assumptions are fragile. It shows that early indicators of success can hide long-term unsustainability. It proves that logistics and adaptation can outweigh initial battlefield superiority. And it warns that ideology can distort risk assessment at the highest level. If we return one last time to the German planning table before June 1941, we can summarize the central illusions in plain terms. The enemy was weaker in endurance than it really was. Time available was longer than it really was. Distances were manageable at the intended tempo. Logistics could follow victory instead of enabling it first. Political and military goals could be pursued simultaneously without decisive trade-offs. None of these assumptions held under campaign conditions. By December 1941, the war Germany wanted had ended. The war Germany got had begun. And that is the core meaning of Barbarossa through German eyes. Planning promised decisive transformation in one campaign. Reality delivered strategic entrapment in a war of exhaustion. The operational arrows on the map moved east quickly. The strategic center of gravity moved the other way. That reversal, more than any single battle, is Barbarossa's real verdict.